You know, back when I was 19 years old, I was given the best piece of advice that I've ever received. I was told, Daryl, when you stop fighting, the fighting stops. Let's talk about that. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining When I Stop Fighting, the podcast. My name is Daryl Dittmer. Today, I'm joined by Janice Johnson Dowd. Janice is a recovering alcoholic with 12 years of sobriety as of Friday, the 14th of February. Congratulations. Very cool.
Thank you.
Janice is a social worker and mother of four who, despite having a background in social work, destroyed her relationships with her family in active addiction and early sobriety. She turned her personal and professional experience into a book, Rebuilding Relationships in Recovery, releasing March 4th, 2025. So close. You must be so excited.
Very much so.
Janice is retired from full-time social work and spends her time teaching, speaking, writing a blog, and working with other recovering alcoholics. Welcome, Janice. So great to have you on.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. I think sharing our stories is an important part of our staying sober and reaching out to others.
Absolutely. And you know, the reason I started this podcast was because I didn't want to do a podcast. I had never thought about doing a podcast. I didn't really care. When I wrote my book, the people I was working with said, you know, that's one way to, you know, potentially get your book out there, get it seen, get it marketed, being a guest on podcasts. And then I had other people say, oh, well, start a podcast. And I said, all right. And I've never really been a podcast listener necessarily, but the coolest thing is, you know, us sharing our stories, because that's how other people can relate, right? And relate to what's happened with us, or, you know, what may currently be happening to them, or plant a seed for something that may happen with them in the future. You know, all those sorts of things. I think it's incredibly valuable.
Yeah, I think so too. I very much think so.
And you know, I look at my life, and I've put my story, and I know you've put your story now in a book, which is really cool. But leaving that trail, right? That little trail of breadcrumbs. And there's so much that comes to mind with that. But you know, planting those seeds, and one of my favorite pictures that I've ever seen is a tree growing out of a rock, and this huge rock is just split in half, right? Because of a seed. And I feel like that's what we have the power to do when we share with others, which is what we have to give.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's also like the analogy of water. You know, water can be very simple, life enhancing, but also can be very forceful and strong and wear big boulders down, and, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Janice, I'm intrigued by your story. You know, I love the part in your bio, honestly, where you say, because it's so honest and so raw, and I think it's just a beautiful thing where, despite having a background in social work, destroyed relationships with family and active addiction and early sobriety. And I think that's really, really powerful stuff. So if you'd give us an idea of from whence you came and what brought you here, I'd love it.
yeah, absolutely. Well, so my story begins with growing up in a dysfunctional home. My dad was a functioning alcoholic. He never outwardly lost jobs, got a DUI, had any health issues, but we had all those subtle problems at home. Don't talk about dad's drinking. Don't talk about the business in the family. Very little communication, keeping secrets. And we moved around quite a bit, which now I look back was a function of his alcoholism and that little job instability. My parents both came from alcoholic backgrounds. They were both born and raised on farms by immigrants. So they had this incredible work ethic. And, you know, when from the outside appearance, they looked like, you know, pretty much the all-American family who was trying to live the American dream. So, and in your book, I read about how you describe your family of origin is very good too. You don't place any blame on them or anything. That's true.
100%.
And I don't place blame on my family, but what I've come to realize is that I learned a lot of dysfunctional patterns of behavior. I never learned how to communicate, how to express my emotions. I grew up very much and became an adult child of an alcoholic, very much a people pleaser, afraid of authority figures, afraid of conflict. One of the key things I haven't talked about in a while is being super aware and able to read other people's body language and feelings, test the temperature of an environment and being sensitive to it. Doing this to a fault, being overly sensitive to it at times. Thankfully, as a kid, I only experimented with alcohol and drugs. And that's for two reasons. One, because I was deathly afraid of my mom. I knew she would kill me or ground me for life. And two, because I was an athlete, and I know you were an athlete too. And athletics was my saving grace. So I look back and I think I always was an addict or an alcoholic. I always had that addictive tendency. I just directed it towards swimming and then school and then perfectionism, things that you wouldn't normally say that girl's got a problem,
Right.
So swimming was a great thing for me. And that's what took me to the University of Michigan. I got a college scholarship to go to school, go blue.
Go blue.
Which was one of the best things for me, because for the first time I was really away from home. I grew up in Texas and I went to University of Michigan, which was about as far away as you could go. However, my older brother went to upstate New York to school. So it wasn't an odd thing for our family to move away. And I look back at that was an escape,
You guys wanted to be in the snow.
Oh my God. No, I'm not a big, we had snow recently and it was such a shocker, but down here in South Alabama. An important part of my childhood too, growing up, is that, which I still carry and struggle with today, is that, this is going to sound very sexist, but girls weren't as important as boys. I take that as a factor of my Scandinavian descent and of my parents growing up on a farm where both of them only had limited women in their household. So the women stayed home, raised the younger kids, cooked, clean, all that kind of thing. And very much growing up, there was two standards in our household. I had two older brothers, and the standards held for them was much higher. They wanted us all to get good grades, to be successful, to look good, to bring honor to the family, all that good alcohol, dysfunctional family stuff. But there wasn't as much pressure on me, which on one hand was good, but on the other hand, it left me with that pervading sense of I'm not as good as, I'll never be as good enough. Now, to my mom, she was not encouraged to get a college education, and she always felt less than. We grew up in a very middle-class neighborhood. Let me say this too, I don't blame my parents. They provided a good foundation, a good home for us. Food, clothing, shelter, taking us to church, make sure we had a good education, involving us in extracurricular activities. It was not a horrible childhood. It was just confusing. And then my mom, of course, because of generational dysfunction, even though she would say to me, you're bright, you're smart, you're attractive, there was that underlying message, the things that she would say about herself. I'm overweight. I wish I'd gone back to college. Those mixed messages we can't help but adopt, which is part of the reason, part of what I do now is talking about that, breaking generational cycles of dysfunction, being aware of all of the messages that we give to our children and our grandchildren. So anyhow, to make a long story short, I went to college because my mom was like, you are going to college. Here's the message, never going to have to depend on a man. You can't trust them. They may never take care of you, you know. And then on the other hand was like, hope you meet and marry someone nice and it's as easy to fall in love. I'm really digressing here.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
The point being, I didn't have really good direction when I went to college. They were like, just go. Don't lose your scholarship because that's, you know, the way we're paying your way. And hope you have a good time, but not too good of a time. So the good part about that is there's no pressure to become like an engineer or doctor or anything like my brothers. And I got to study and take classes and everything that I enjoyed. So of course I was drawn to psychology, social work. Of course I was drawn to the PhD students and taking upper graduate classes and assisting on their research projects because it was fascinating to me. And that opened the door into psychology and social work and my beginning of my insight into my stuff and being able to realize how dysfunctional my family really was. And so after 4 years, I decided to go to grad school, become a social worker, and was obviously drawn to treatment with alcoholics and addicts because that's what I knew. I won't go into the fine details. So my first job out of school was in an addiction treatment center. In graduate school, I was a teaching assistant for Dr. Clayton Shorkey, who taught all the classes in undergrad and grad on drug and alcohol addiction treatment modalities. I did research for him. I mean, it all fell in naturally. It was like powers were be. Oh, wait, you have a quote in your book. When the student is ready. It was like that. Like, okay, I'm ready. I'm open. This is the direction you're going to push. All during that time, I drank socially, but I controlled my drinking because of my sports, you know. And there was that message in my mind. I don't want to become an alcoholic like my dad. And then another pervading message was, I want to make sure I don't do to my kids what my parents did to me. I want to raise my kids different. I want to help other kids. So immediately I was drawn to helping families, adolescents, teens, all of that. So I started my career by helping families, and that served me for a while. Alcohol was not a big part of my life because I was heavily involved with ALANON, ACA, and open AA meetings at that point. You know, to be a good therapist, have a good understanding, you have to understand your clientele, you have to understand the principles. So I did a lot of good self-care back then. That's not to say I wasn't still crazy. Those underlying crazy things were still there. I was still insecure, trying to prove myself by achievements, trying to find love and affection through picking unattainable men. You know, I was still going sideways. I just had some self-help skills that kept me from drinking as a coping skill for my struggles. And that worked for a long time until I stopped taking care of myself, which happened gradually and slowly. So I met and married my husband. For the first 10, 12 years of our marriage, we rarely had alcohol in our home. We drank socially. But I spent most of my time focusing on balancing my job and being a mom. And for 10 years, for all of my 30s, literally, I was pregnant, breastfeeding, you know, or trying to get pregnant again because I have 4 kids in 8 years. So I didn't drink because also during that time, I want to say that I transferred some of those skills to like trying to be the perfect overachiever mom. You know, I put my energy that I used to mask my feelings before through sports or through my education. Now I was putting into parenting. My daughter recently said on a podcast, yeah, my mom, which was great to hear. She goes, yeah, when I was little, my mom was like the greatest mom in the world. She was a volunteer at the school and she worked and she did this and that. And I was like, yeah, but that was also really because I was covering up for all my insecurities. And I was still really struggling with, I should be great at all these things. And I feel inadequate at all. So once I was done having babies and stressors catch up with you, I started drinking. And it started very slow. My now ex-husband and I, we bought a second little home over in Milton, Florida on the bay there. And that initiated a lot more social drinking and day drinking and things like that. And again, I'm not blaming that, but I gradually put in more and more alcohol. And I don't know how you feel about the genetic component, but I believe there's a strong genetic component. And I tell my kids this all the time. Your mom is an alcoholic. You probably carry the gene, came from both sides of my family. And I believe if you put enough alcohol in your system, you're going to trigger that gene. I don't know. I mean, that's just my opinion.
Sure.
So, and I think it's a good lesson for them. Regardless, I became an alcoholic over the course of like 10 years. I had some in my 40s, some very challenging times with parents becoming ill, you know, typical struggles in marriages. And I drank more and more. And I drank until the drinking was the primary problem, as opposed to the problems, my anxiety or depression or self-esteem issues. So the last 3 years or so of my drinking, because it's hard to define where you go from social drinking to problem to alcoholic drinking. For me, it is. But the last 3 years, I was emotionally struggling with, I might be an alcoholic. I don't want to be an alcoholic. Oh my God, I can't believe I'm an alcoholic. Trying to control and moderate my drinking, trying to fix myself in ways I had done before, like exercise, going to therapy, getting on an antidepressant. I'd had terrible postpartum depression after 2 of my kids and had been on antidepressants for that, which worked wonderfully for me. So I tried all of those things, went to therapy, and you know, it didn't work because the primary problem at that point was the drinking. So eventually in therapy, my therapist suggested I try one of those 12-step meetings. She wasn't really, she was not an addiction specialist, but she was aware of the resources and I knew all about it. And I was like, okay, I'll go. And here's the crazy part. Here's where the social work part is. So those last 8 years or so, I was only volunteering. I wasn't a paid professional social worker at that time. But despite having that background, our disease is so cunning, baffling, and powerful. The denial is so rich. And then, of course, your brain gets muddled from the alcohol that I couldn't see clearly that I was slipping into the alcoholism. And the denial was the greatest thing. And because I was still like soccer mom, food team mom, things like that, I could say to myself, well, see, I'm still a good mom. I'm still doing these things. But at night, I was the bitchy, cranky mom who was full of self-pity and nagged and, you know, emotionally abused my kids. So anyhow, despite having that background, the disease is more powerful than all the education and all of the support, which is why one of my messages today is that you can't do this alone. You know, you need help. And we get sober and stay sober by being honest and asking for help. So eventually I went to my first AA meeting and it was like a light went off. I was an alcoholic for a couple of weeks because I looked for all the differences rather than the similarities. Like I remember the first meeting, there was 3 or 4 of us. Here's another God thing. 4 of us that were there for the first time. So they made it a first step meeting, which is for people who are listening. everyone shares a short, like 4 or 5 minute version of their first step, how their life became powerless and unmanageable. And as everyone shared around the table, it was a small group. There was probably 15 or 20 of us there that day. I was like, oh, that hadn't happened to me. That hadn't happened to me. That hadn't happened to me. So my head was like, phew. Until we got to this man buddy who was literally like the next to last person, who worked in a drug and alcohol treatment center when he got his first, second, third DUIs, and shared how he had been in denial. He was working with alcoholics and addicts and still couldn't see his own drinking. And I was like, dang, I can relate to that. Maybe there is someone like me. And the great part about him sharing his story too is it began to help me reduce the shame I felt about becoming an alcoholic despite knowing better. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, it does.
Part of those last couple of years was the guilt and shame was so great because once I recognized I was putting my kids through hell, my husband through hell, and I was distancing myself from my friends and extended family, the shame was so great, and you get caught into that cycle of like, okay, tomorrow I'm not going to drink. Tomorrow I won't drink. And then, 6 o'clock rolls around, you go, oh, I didn't drink right after school, so I'm entitled to a glass of wine with dinner. And that whole cycle. Well, tomorrow I'll start again.
Yeah.
So anyhow, I kept going to AA. I started trying. I started working the AA program. And my book has been accused of being kind of strong in 12-step philosophy, but I don't see it that way. I personally believe there's a ton of different ways to get sober, just as there's a ton of different higher powers you can choose to rely on. But AA worked for me. So I went to AA literally almost every day for the next 90 days, but didn't really work the program. I just went to the meetings. I would get 2 or 3 days. The weekend would come around. The holidays would come around, tailgating, whatever the excuse. I was like, well, I'll just have a few drinks at this tailgate and I'll start again Monday. Did you ever? Well, no, you probably didn't do that because you were so young.
I was young. Yeah. Different. Well, my story was briefly, I knew there were some major issues.
Mm-hmm.
I just didn't necessarily attribute them to drugs and alcohol. So they were just, this sort of, I think I talk about a little bit in my book, big hole in the middle of my chest,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of a black hole. Everything just sorts of get sucked in, including my soul and everything else. And that's why I like when they talk about in the big book, they talk about I think it's in the big book, spiritual malady,
Mm-hmm.
which I think, based on when that was written, you could almost even look at that as emotional / spiritual malady, I believe.
I think so too.
Yeah.
And that's where I was at. My bottom was like that. It was an emotional devastation, brokenness. So I did have the classic, like drunken, embarrassment in front of my family, drove drunk, took out my neighbor's mailbox on the last night before my best friend and family intervened on me and told me I had to go to treatment. Towards the end of those 90 days, I had started telling people that I was trying. I wasn't trying to do it in secret anymore. I started saying, yes, I'm an alcoholic. So at that intervention, I was still like, no, I know I can do it with AA. I'm really committed now. But it was clear at that time that my husband was at his wit's end, and there was the threat that he would take my children from me and move out if I didn't go to treatment. So I went to treatment, and I'm really glad that I did. And I'm, again, not saying that's the only way to get sober, because I know you went to treatment too, but because I know a lot of people who got sober just through AA, through their other support organizations. So, but I went to treatment. and fell back into that pattern of, despite being a social worker and knowing that my family needed me and needed for me to get well and needed for me to become back involved in their life, I literally abandoned them all over again when I went to treatment. I got so wrapped up in my own recovery, two things: my own recovery, commitment to learning the skills and tools, and also caught up in my fear of rejection and abandonment I was afraid they would reject me. I'd had those rules sat down that I put up a wall between myself and them under the pretense of, I'm working on my recovery. I got to do this. This is the most important thing. And I feel like that a lot of treatment centers, for a number of different reasons, and mine in particular, let me just talk about mine. The primary focus was on helping the addict or alcoholic build up the skills, do the work they needed to do. So when they left treatment, they had a plan for sobriety. There was not a great deal of attention put on the family. In my situation, again, it was aggravated by the fact that my family lived 250 miles away. All four of my kids were involved in extracurricular activities. So my husband, all of those responsibilities fell on him. And part of it was a time issue. It was hard for them to get up and see me, which I took as rejection. I made excuses for them, and that fueled my putting up the wall. And then I say this in the book, and I've said this on Instagram all the time. I also naively thought if I just got sober, that once I left treatment, that would be the start of something good. I didn't think about the extra work I needed to do to repair and rebuild those relationships. I also refused to look early on at the damage I had done to my kids, because in my head I said, well, what I did wasn't as bad as. And I said, well, most of my drinking came at home. I never, what were some of my nevers? I mean, now that I think back, some of those nevers I did do. Like I used to say, I never really embarrassed my kids in public. Well, yeah, I did. I drank at their soccer games. I went to my son. My son has been in a band, my oldest son, off and on. I went to one of his, I passed out with one of his band performances. So yes, I did do those embarrassing things, but I downplayed them, which is, I think, an important part of rebuilding your relationship with your family, is owning up, taking responsibility, which I think is really important and seems to be one of the principles in your book, and validating the feelings of your families and your loved ones. So to make a long story short, or less long, it took me until I was about 6 months sober before I realized the damage I'd done with my family. And that was aggravated again. I went from 4 weeks of treatment. I ended up staying 12 because I had some real issues I needed to deal with. The divide between me and my family grew. So when it was time for me to leave treatment, between my issues and the growing hostility between my relationship with myself and a couple of my family members, they recommended I go to a halfway house. So I went from 12 weeks of treatment to 3 months at a halfway house, and another year at like a 3/4 way house, all separated from my family. And it was like at 6 months where I realized I had lost my family, and that the only people I had in my life was my 12-step group, my coworkers at my little part-time job, my therapist, and my sponsors. And it really began to hurt. And I really began to start to fix those relationships, which of course, I've abandoned my kids theoretically and physically for 6 more months. Their walls are up even higher now too. So it took a lot of work, a lot of trial and error, a lot of talking to a other people in the program, other parents, some of their kids. I mean, I met with some of my friends' kids to ask them what was working for them. And then I went back to the books too, and also went back to therapy with I've been in therapy all the time, but I went back and became willing to address those family of origin issues that fueled my inability or not willingness to reconnect with my family, which I probably get it. This might sound like psychobabble now, but I think it's an important part of ultimate long-term recovery is to you have to take some time to look at that history and how it interferes with your current.
Sure.
So eventually I repaired those relationships. I mean, not completely. They're still growing and improving today, but it kind of became my mission. This is how my book was born, because once I got to the other side of all of that, anytime I had the opportunity to tell my story, to speak at a treatment center, to lead a discussion, my discussions were always about family. And people were like, this is really important. No one talks about this. And it snowballed into a book. And my hopes that, more families will be invited into treatment earlier than my family was. So, which thankfully, I'm getting a lot of information in. Just stop me if I'm rambling on. Thankfully, I think some of the problems that we had back then, like we didn't have Zoom 12 years ago to do Zoom family counseling. I think some of those things we can manage a lot better now. But I still think especially in early recovery, those of us in early recovery need some direction on how to repair relationships. And I still see it at meetings. I don't know if you do, but occasionally in a meeting, I'll hear someone say, yeah, I'm sober 5 years, but I haven't talked to my family in 8. And if it's because it's a dysfunctional family, that's one thing. But if they're missing that family, that's another thing, So.
Yeah, I think relationships are what makes the world go round, right? I mean, that's what we have. We have relationships, and I'm a big proponent, and obviously you are too. I have to build the relationship with myself in conjunction with building my relationship with others. And you mentioned it has to do with honesty, and it has to do with, taking a look at some of the things that I did and some of the things that came from me. And so important when you talk about sobriety. Sobriety is not the end. Sobriety is just the beginning, putting away the drink, putting away the drugs, putting away whatever it is, food, gambling, sex, blah, 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 whatever it is. That's only the beginning of the healing part, because I'm not capable of fixing anything while I'm still mired in that behemoth.
Mm-hmm.
And I also, truly believe, and you touched on so many things. I was writing a few things down, but there's we can gradually, and you mentioned this, we can gradually lose our grip on our self-care.
Mm-hmm.
We can gradually say, oh, I don't need to do my breath work today. I don't need to meditate today. I don't need to eat right today. I don't need to exercise, right? And some of those things fall by the wayside, but those are the things that keep us in a position where we can have wonderful relationships. If, to me, I believe, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, I cannot have healthy relationships or rebuild relationships if I'm not working real hard on me, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a beautiful way to say it. And that's kind of what I did when I went back to looking at that in therapy, was that next step. Like I had learned I had the tools to be sober, but now I needed to come to terms with my own weaknesses, strengths, and the guilt and shame, that haunted me, and I didn't want to look at it. So there was also some trauma there. And for people who have trauma, there's a lot of good tools now like EMDR that can help repair some of those wounds so that sobriety is easier, relationships are easier.
We have to, my thing, I think, is, and it has to do with, a lot of the past stuff, the guilt and the shame. But I have to allow myself to feel those things and what they feel like, and allow myself to cry and allow myself to sob. And, there's times, even now, and I've been doing this for a little bit, and it's some of the most beautiful times. I'll be sitting out on my deck, and sometimes I'll do it at 4:00 in the morning. I'll just be looking at the stars and looking for, shooting stars. And I'll start thinking about my mom and dad and, thanking them for being my parents. And then I start to feel some things, and things come up, and, I'm sorry that I hurt you, and those sorts of things. And then I'll just cry for a while. And it's the most healing thing. And I'm almost 60 years old. Like it's been a long time, and my parents have both been gone for a long time, but it's such a beautiful cleansing, which I think, we all need to just slow down. And I'm not going to speak for anyone else, but, slow down, feel some of those things, allow myself to just cleanse, right? And clear away some of that stuff that may be stuck inside me.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And in fact, yesterday I have a part-time job, which is a lot of fun. And for whatever reason, like I had this moment like, oh, I'd really like to call my mom and tell her about this. But my mom's been gone since 2015. And then I was hit with a wave of grief. Being at work, I was like, oh, I can't process this. Now, here's where the God thing comes in. Like within 10 minutes, my daughter calls me. And I was like, what's up? You know what I mean? I think that was the universe saying, okay, you don't have your mom, but you got your daughter, and you have this relationship, and look at how beautiful it is now. And you honor your mother, because I couldn't grieve at that job at the work, right? Well, I probably could have gone into the bathroom and had a good cry, but instead I was stuffing the feelings down. But I was given this little gift of an opportunity to heal it in a way that, well, it was kind of special to me, and it was healing to me. And I didn't have to worry about other people going, why is she so emotional right now? I didn't have to worry about being judged or any of that stuff. So yeah, healing comes in a number of different ways too. Yeah, a good cry is wonderful. I have a hard time crying. That's something I'm still working on.
Yeah, I'm my upbringing was just be tough, just take care of business, blah blah blah. But there'll be times, honestly, I'll be watching America's Got Talent, and somebody will do really well, and I'll feel so good for them, and I'll start like tearing up a little bit. It's hilarious, because it's not, it's kind of hilarious to me.
No, but
it's cool. I love that I am allowing that to happen, as opposed to, shove it down.
Yeah. So
one of the things you talked about was trying, and that word came out of your mouth. And I love that word because it's so important in taking responsibility. We have to take responsibility for our own life, for our relationships, for our recovery, for all of these things. And the only way we can do that is to figure it out. And the only way we can figure it out is to try, right? So I love that you talked about that. I think that sometimes, if I think that my life is 100% on me, then I'm beginning to experience freedom. That's how I look at it.
Expand upon that a little bit. I'm not sure I understand.
Well, if I'm saying, oh, it was their fault, or that's not on me, that's on them, or pointing the finger, or, feeling like I'm a victim of, or looking back and blaming it on my parents or whomever,
Yeah.
then I'm not free, because I'm attached to all of those things, either next to me or in my past or whatever it is. When I can take 100% responsibility, not necessarily for what other people do, because they do what they do, but how am I going to respond? How am I going to allow that to sift through the sand of me? And that's what I mean by the freedom part, because the freedom is knowing that I am responsible for all of it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I appreciate you expanding upon that. And I agree with you. I mean, and I think that was one of the mistakes I made with my family too. Like in the early stages of the relationships, that because you did this, I felt that, as opposed to I'm feeling this, I have to take ownership of my feelings, and it's my responsibility to respond in a manner that helps me convey what I need to say or where I need to go with this. I'm taking your very large principle and putting it down into one of the ways that I applied it. But yeah, no, I think responsibility is huge. Yeah.
And allowing ourselves to understand that, allow is one of my favorite words in the English language, because there's so much involved in that. But allowing ourselves to understand that it's not going to happen all in one day, and that's one of the things that I like to allude to in my books, is the fighting part, that if I'm allowing, I'm not fighting. When I first got sober, I was like, oh, I'm sober now, I shouldn't be feeling that. I shouldn't be thinking that. I shouldn't be, all those we should on ourselves. And, and so that's, to me, that's the fight. And the fight gets a little more subtle over time, because first we're fighting, alcohol and family and, all these sort of macro things. And then the fight gets a little more subtle, but we have to follow the trail, right, on what the fights are. So we're gonna have to wrap here in a couple of minutes, but I want to talk a little bit more about your book. If you would give us a couple minutes on anything you'd like us to know about the book, and I'll be your first customer. Maybe not. I'll be one of the first 10, maybe, once you let me know it comes out. But
okay. Well, it is available for pre-order now on all the websites: Barnes & Noble, Amazon.
Cool.
Walmart, all of that. But essentially, it is the book that I wrote that I wish had been available for me when I was in treatment. It's got a lot of information about, sorry, I don't know how to turn off my phone. A lot of information about tools to get you started. It is written as a guide to anyone really in recovery, even if you're recovering from a number of mental illnesses, PTSD, OCD, bipolar. You can use these same tools in those situations as well. Anyone who's struggling to repair relationships. And I address very briefly a little bit of the brain science of addiction in a way that's easy to understand, so you don't get too wrapped up in the terminology. Also, really proud of the chapter on amends, how to make it a good amends, and how that differs from an apology. And then the ongoing work that it takes. So I'm not doing a great sales pitch, but again,
no, you are.
I'm very proud of the book. It's not written as a textbook. It's written to the everyday person, though I think every addiction therapist should have one in their office. So
yeah, no, that's beautiful. And I commend you for writing the book, and I congratulate you for doing that. And I will absolutely read it and give you a review, because I know that helps, which is really cool.
yes,
don't forget about Goodreads. Got to do a review on Goodreads as well.
I will.
Some of some of the things that I've learned in terms of just helping authors and helping that. But there's again, relationships are all we have. I mean, relationships are what makes the world go around, and what am I doing to keep my side of the street clean, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's, to me, that's what it's all about. So where can we find you, Janice? I feel like we need to do a part 2 of this podcast, and we probably will at some point, but where can we find you?
My website is www.janicejonsondowd.com. I'm on Instagram under the handle parenting_in_recovery. So parenting and recovery. And those are my 2. I have a newsletter and a blog that you can access through my website. Please sign up for the newsletter, because that's where it's a once a month thing. I don't besiege you. It's a kind of a fun, like I will take your book and review it on there along with Goodreads and all of that. So every month I highlight like a blog, a podcast, a book, and sometimes a person who's inspired me, a mental health professional, or someone who's doing great in the mental health field. And it's just a quick, easy read. So.
Yeah, very cool. I'm going to sign up for that after my next recording, and I will definitely do that. And I'm going to pre-order your book for sure. Yeah, that's really cool. I'm so happy about, that you talk about this thing that doesn't get talked about enough. I know it's in the steps. I know the steps are a great guide for us and all that sort of thing, but to have, your book, Rebuilding Relationships and Recovery, is and it's spot on in terms of the title. I think it's phenomenal, and recovery or not, I think everybody on the planet can use it. Right. So
I agree. It's got good basic tools in it for all of us. Yeah.
That's phenomenal. So Janice, thank you so much for joining me. I know we are going to need to do this again, because there's of the ground we covered, we probably covered about 1% of what we could cover. You and I were acquainted on Instagram, which is really cool. And you have great stuff on Instagram. So I would, say anybody who has Instagram, follow Janice, Parenting and Recovery, and because I love reading your stuff. So
thank you.
Thanks for coming on, and I know we'll be in touch.
Thanks for having me. Have a great day.
You as well. Thank you. If you've enjoyed When I Stop Fighting the podcast, please check out my books and my journals on my website, daryldittmer.com. Enjoy a 15% discount by using the code PODCAST, DARYLDITTMER.com. Thanks again.